Hi, I'm Allie. Join me for creating this beautiful herringbone ribbon necklace. Some simple supplies and just a nice, simple technique. If you need anything, go ahead and check below the video to shop with us online. There's links there in the description. So we're going to begin our design with a long piece of herringbone. This is going to be a single row of herringbone stitch where we're decorating the exterior or the sides with an extra little seed bead. I'm using two 15-0s for this, and we're going to make a long portion that's going to wrap over our beads and then then end as we continue up the necklace. You're going to want about 5 feet of thread, and I have a stop bead on my thread here that I want about 10 inches prior to that. Mine has a little bit less just because I'm using it for example purposes. I'm going to use my Toho Hematite color on the interior, and then I'm using just this nice opaque luster Miyuki 11 or 15-0 on the sides. I have 2 beads on my thread and needle, and I'm using a size 12, but you can use a 10. And I'm going to sew up through bead number 1 toward bead number 2. So starting at the stop bead, basically sewing back up through bead number 1. Once I'm back up through bead number 1, those 2 beads are going to sit side by side. Grab 2 more beads. We're coming out bead number 1, and after adding 2 beads, we're going to go through and down bead number 2. That's going to get those beads to sit right on an angle. To cover up the thread and add that nice little cream accent, you're going to grab one 15-0 in the opaque luster, and you're going to go back up through bead number 2 in the herringbone row that you just added. So my needle comes out of bead number 2 from the first row. I put on a 15 and I go into bead number 2 from the second row toward bead number 1, or your needle coming out the middle. When I'm out the middle between my beads from the previous herringbone row, I'm going to add 2 more beads. Coming out of bead number 2 there, I'm going to go down bead number 1. So those 2 beads get added in the middle. Normally I flip this in my hand as I'm working with it. I'm keeping it situated like this just so you can see it and which side your thread is going to. When you're out through the second or that bead there of the previous row, you grab your 15-0. It's going to look awkward for me. And I'm going to sew back up through bead number 2 that I just added. If it pulls apart like that, just give a nice little tight pull and get it back into place. From here, I'm coming out of that second bead that I added in the last row, the bead on the left, add 2 beads, go down through bead number 1, the bead that's on the right. Give a nice tight pull so they sit in that nice herringbone V section. Add a 15, go back up through bead number 2 from the previous row that you just added. So here's where you're going to see me flip hands. I always prefer to sew from the left to the right, adding my 2 beads, sewing down that second bead there, adding a 15-0 for this side, sewing back from that second bead from the previous row up to and through the second bead from the row I just added, needle coming out towards the center, and then I'm going to flip it in my hand. So see how I just flipped the design? The stop bead was at the bottom, now it's at the top of the screen. 2 beads get added, coming out of bead number 1, sew down through bead number 2, pull that nice and tightly on your thread, not your needle. Grab a 15, sew back up through bead number 2. As I'm sewing back through bead number 2, I flip it in my hand, so that way I'm always sewing and adding. And this is just a quicker, faster way to do that herringbone stitch. 2 beads get added, 15 goes on, back up through bead number 2. And then once again, flipping it in my hand, so that way I'm adding the beads. Now you're going to continue this over and over and over again as you create this nice herringbone stitch design in that nice flat strip. So once you have approximately 146 of your herringbone rows, what I did to get that count was I counted my white beads along the edge here at about 73 and doubled that because each bead along the side there is going to be 2 rows rather than counting up and down. So I'm coming out of my last section here of my herringbone stitch, and it looks like it's time for me to add another set of my 15-0s in that hematite color. Instead, I'm going to get out my 8mm Czech glass fire polished rounds here. And I'm also going to get ready with my 10mm white pearls. So I have my 10mm white pearls here. And I'm going to have some of my 8mm. Coming out of this stitch here, this is where it's going to be important to start counting. I'm going to take my needle and thread and sew through first one of my 8mm beads. I'm going to sew over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to look at that 5th bead and I'm going to sew through the middle of the herringbone stitch there at the 5th white bead. And see how it turns over and goes right through the center. Next, I'm going to change it up. I'm going to add one of my bigger 10mm pearls. Now obviously the 10mm pearl is going to be larger than the 8mm bead. So I'm coming out the hole there, and I'm going to look at my white bead coming out right there in the middle of the hole. I'm going to count over 6. So I have my bead that I'm coming out of, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Where that 6th bead is now, I'm going to sew through again the center of that herringbone. So I'm not adding any beads, I'm not doing anything there, I'm just sewing through the center of the herringbone. Once again, add an 8mm bead, pinch that down and you can see it fits there perfectly. Count the bead that you're going and sitting on there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to count over 5. You can also just pull it over there, but it's helpful to keep count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Go right where that 5th one is and sew through. And get that right along the side. So simple, so easy. Add my next pearl, count over, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Grab the thread. If you're not in the right section, you'll be able to tell. Just take your needle back out and sew on to your herringbone stitch. I'm going to continue using up these rows and sewing through all of my beads to get that nice back and forth motion. When you get to the end, you should see that nice weave around the beads. You should also end pretty much exactly at the end of the piece. I ended up with 8 of my faceted round crystals and 7 of my pearls. I'm going to completely close off this section, and we're going to reinforce and work with this as one unit as we go in and continue to finish our necklace. From here at the end, I'm going through that last section of herringbone and I have my stop bead on there. What I want you to do is take that last section and sew through that final section of thread, or that first section of thread between beads 1 and 2. We're going to bring the thread out then towards itself, and we're going to tie a nice simple knot, moving this starter thread off. If you have the starter thread kept on and you had those 10 inches, you can keep that on to create one side of your piece. I'm going to start with a whole nother piece of thread, going in here and tying this off to finish off that design. So at this point here, basically our centerpiece for our necklace is completed. I'm going to then take my thread burner or my thread zap, burn those edges, and then we'll get ready with another piece of thread to start designing further on the piece, adding in just a nice simple collection of our crystals and our Czech glass, finishing off with our pearls as we expand the length of our necklace but keep that concentration toward the front. So once you have that center section completed, we're going to go in and create the sides of the necklace to give length along the back. You can make this longer by adding more of the crystals that I'm using, which are the half silver, and these are a 4mm round, or adding more of the Czech glass or more pearls into the design. I end up with 18 of my 4mm faceted round crystals, and then I have 7 of my Czech crystals, followed by 1 more of my pearls. To keep that darker hematite flow, I've added 1/15 between each of those beads. I started out with a new 5-foot section of thread, and added a stop bead onto the end, leaving myself a couple inches to tie onto as we get ready to string through. Not only are we stringing through these once, but after we add our clasp to the other side, we're gonna string back through again to really reinforce. If you have a beading wire and you wanna use beading wire, you can do that as well, a beading cable. I'm going to just keep using the wildfire thread. So I have that stop bead on, I've strung all of my beads, again, 18 fours, and then with the 8 millimeters, I did 7, followed by 1 of my 10 millimeter pearl. I'm gonna pick up this center ribbon section, and I don't want you to overthink it. All we're doing is we're sewing right through the beads and the herringbone stitch that we've already done. So I kind of put my needle in, wiggle it around. You'll usually get about 2 inches into the design, then need to bring the needle out, pull the thread through, and then put your needle back in and continue on. Even if you need to do each bead by itself, that's totally fine too. Most likely you can get a bead, the herringbone, and a bead before you pull that needle out. I'm going to go the whole way through my design now, taking that thread to the opposite end, again feeding it through the actual herringbone stitch, through all the beads, and then we'll get ready on the other side after exiting through that herringbone stitch to start with our pearl and then go into our 8s and our 4 millimeters, all separated out by that Hematite Toho 15-0. So once you string through and you have the same pattern on the opposite side as the start, you're gonna end up with about an 18-inch necklace. We're gonna get ready to add our nice Potomac's clasp. Another idea, if you want to, is actually to put this Potomac clasp on the side and then make this section really long, wrap around the neck as a little side piece. Fun idea if you want to try it out. From here, I'm out this second row of beads, again mirroring the first, and I'm going to take my thread and needle after having a 15-0 there. I'm going to go through this Potomac's Rivoli clasp. I'm going to come back down through that same 15, but I'm going to go into the opposite side because we want to reinforce our clasp. So I'm going to go into the opposite side of that 15-0 seed bead. I'll let that go down closer so you can see I'm pulling a little bit more. We're then going to go back through the clasp one more time. Loop around. Make sure that you're not looping around any of your crystals there. My thread wants to loop around my crystals. Come on over. And then if you want to, you can take that apart so you don't have that weight coming down. From here, I'm going to see which direction I last went into that seed bead. Come in from the opposite end again, going through that 15-0 seed bead, right on that side there. Once I'm through there, I have 2 strands reinforcing my clasp there. Give a nice little tight pull. Now it's time to retrace your steps. So to retrace your steps, you're going to take your thread and needle the whole way down through that project, the whole way over till we get to the stop bead on the opposite side. Once you have your thread the whole way through your necklace, so we came out the end, added our clasp, and we worked the whole way back through and snaked through the necklace, my thread and needle are coming out right next to that stop bead. I'm going to add a 15-0 onto the thread. I'm going to grab my clasp, sew through the clasp. Once again, grab that 15-0 from the opposite side. So I'm going to go in from the bottom here, thread's coming out the top. Pull that down towards the project. Go back through the clasp, into the opposite side again of that seed bead. We're going to pull off that stop bead. Sometimes it's easier said than done if you get a nice hook on there. And we're going to tie those 2 thread ends together. So I'm just going to tie that thread end. I'll get that stop bead off after. Tie that thread end into there. Tie those 2 threads together. Nice and tight right on the end. I'm going to tie another knot, and then I'm going to take the thread that's attached to the clasp, burn down the thread end there to disconnect it. Take my other thread down just a couple passes and then burn it off as well. That way I don't have two ends of my thread that have burned sections that are going to be the focus there at the clasp. From here then, all I need to do is take my E6000 glue in this beautiful opal Rivoli into that 14mm setting, and finish up this beautiful herringbone ribbon necklace design. It's 18 inches in the measurements that I gave. You can always add more crystals into the design, add more Czech glass into the design, even make your herringbone section longer if you want that to be more in the focus. I usually prefer my necklaces with this design to be about 16 inches, so I would just take off some of the crystals there toward the end as I work through and finish it up. Thanks so much for joining me. Remember, if you need any materials, look below the video to shop with us online. We have links there in the description for you. Also, if you haven't already yet, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss anything from us here at Potomac Beads. Remember, you can always give your feedback in the comments section with different counts that you did, different descriptions for different bead options, and anything that might help out other Potomac beaders that are learning and progressing along the way. Hope you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for the next one.